My name is Linda Whitfield, and at 64 years old, I've learned that the sweetest revenge isn't served hot in a moment of rage. It's served ice cold, after years of careful planning, when your enemy least expects it. But let me start at the beginning, with the sound that changed everything. The doorbell of my penthouse apartment, chiming at exactly 3:17 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was standing in my marble-floored foyer, wearing the cream-colored cashmere dress I'd chosen specifically for this moment, my long silver hair perfectly styled, my grandmother's pearls gleaming at my throat. Through the security monitor, I could see her, my daughter Sarah, now 38 years old, standing in the hallway with her 19-year-old daughter Emma beside her. Sarah looked nervous, fidgeting with her designer handbag in that way she'd done since childhood, when she wanted something she knew she didn't deserve. Emma appeared uncomfortable, glancing around the expensive hallway as if she'd never seen luxury before, which, given their current financial situation, she probably hadn't. They'd both changed since I'd last seen them 3 years ago. Sarah's blonde hair showed expensive highlights that couldn't quite hide the stress lines around her eyes. Emma had grown tall and lean, with the kind of natural beauty that reminded me painfully of myself at that age. Both wore clothes that were trying too hard to look casual, the kind of outfit you choose when you want to appear humble while asking for money. I let the doorbell ring 3 more times before I finally approached the door. Each chime echoed through my penthouse like a death knell for the relationship I'd once treasured above all others. When I opened the door, I didn't step aside to let them in. I simply stood there, filling the doorframe, looking at the 2 people who had abandoned me during the darkest period of my life. "Hello, Mother," Sarah said, her voice carefully modulated to sound warm and loving. "You look wonderful. Doesn't she look wonderful, Emma?" Emma nodded obediently, though I could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Hi, Grandma Linda. It's been too long." "Has it?" I replied, my voice perfectly neutral. I hadn't noticed. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Sarah's smile faltered slightly, but she pressed on with the performance she'd clearly rehearsed. "We heard about Uncle James," she said, her voice dropping to an appropriately sympathetic tone. "I'm so sorry for your loss. He was such a wonderful man." "Yes, he was," I agreed. "Unlike some people, James never forgot I existed." Sarah flinched at the barb, but recovered quickly. "Mother, I know things have been difficult between us, but I was hoping we could talk. Maybe start fresh." I studied her face, noting the carefully applied makeup that couldn't quite hide the desperation in her eyes. Behind her, Emma shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. "Start fresh," I repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. "How interesting. You only remember I exist now that there's a penthouse attached to my name." The color drained from Sarah's face. "That's not. I mean, of course I'm happy that Uncle James left you this beautiful place, but that's not why." "Isn't it?" I interrupted, my voice still maddeningly calm. "Then perhaps you can explain where you were for the past 3 years. Where were you when I was fighting for my life? Where were you when I was so weak from chemotherapy that I couldn't lift my head off the pillow? Where were you when I lay in that hospital bed, staring at an empty chair where my daughter should have been sitting?" Sarah's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Emma looked stricken, her young face crumpling as she began to understand the depth of her family's dysfunction. "Mother, please," Sarah finally managed. "I know I made mistakes, but..." "Mistakes?" I stepped forward slightly, forcing her to take a step back. "Abandoning your mother during cancer treatment isn't a mistake, Sarah. It's a choice. A choice that reveals exactly who you are." I saw neighbors beginning to peek out of their doors, drawn by the sound of our conversation. Mrs. Ellis from 4B was pretending to check her mail while obviously eavesdropping. "Perfect. You want to start fresh?" I continued, my voice carrying clearly down the hallway. Then let me be perfectly clear about our relationship. You are not welcome in my home. You are not welcome in my life. And you are certainly not welcome to any part of my inheritance. Sarah's carefully constructed facade finally cracked. You can't be serious. I'm your daughter. My daughter died 3 years ago. I replied without emotion. She died in a hospital room while I was fighting cancer alone. What you are is a stranger who happens to share my last name. Emma burst into tears. Grandma, please. Mom made mistakes, but we're family. I looked at this beautiful young woman, my granddaughter, who had inherited my eyes and my stubborn chin, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Family, I said quietly, shows up when it matters. Family doesn't wait until there's money involved to remember they love you. I stepped back into my penthouse and began to close the door. Sarah lunged forward, pressing her hand against it.
Wait.
Mother, please.
We need to talk about this.
We need nothing, I said, looking directly into her eyes. But you, Sarah, need everything. And that is exactly what you'll get from me. I closed the door with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot in the marble foyer. Through the security monitor, I watched them stand there for several long minutes, Sarah arguing in hushed tones while Emma sobbed quietly. Eventually, they left, but not before I saw Sarah pull out her phone and make what was clearly an angry call to someone, probably her husband Richard, the failed businessman who'd undoubtedly sent her here to beg for money. I walked to my living room windows, which offered a panoramic view of Manhattan's skyline. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the city, and somewhere down there, my daughter was probably crying in her car, finally understanding that the mother she'd taken for granted was gone forever.
Good.
People think revenge is about anger, about lashing out in the heat of the moment. They're wrong. Real revenge, the kind that truly destroys your enemy, requires patience, planning, and the kind of cold calculation that comes only from profound betrayal. I had been patient for 3 years, ever since the last chemotherapy session when I'd finally accepted that my daughter would never walk through that hospital room door. I had planned for 18 months, ever since James's death had given me both the means and the perfect trap. And now, finally, I was ready to execute the most satisfying campaign of my life. Sarah thought she could waltz back into my life now that I had money. She thought she could play the loving daughter, erase 3 years of abandonment with a few apologetic words and some crocodile tears. She was about to learn that some doors, once closed, can never be opened again. As I stood in my penthouse, surrounded by luxury that James had worked his entire life to achieve, I smiled for the first time in years. Not the polite smile I showed to acquaintances, or the bitter smile that had become my default expression during chemotherapy. This was the smile of a woman who had just fired the opening shot in a war that would end with her enemy's complete and utter destruction. Sarah wanted my inheritance. She was welcome to try to take it. But first, she was going to pay for every day she'd left me to fight cancer alone. To understand why I felt no mercy for Sarah that day, you need to understand what the 3 years before had been like. You need to know what it means to fight for your life while the people who should love you most act as if you've already died. The diagnosis came on a Thursday in March, delivered by Dr. Peterson in the same gentle tone he probably used to discuss the weather. I'm afraid it's breast cancer, Linda. Stage 2, which means it's aggressive but treatable. Treatable. Such a clinical word for the hell that was about to consume my life. I called Sarah within an hour of leaving the doctor's office. She was at work, some marketing job she'd taken after her previous business venture failed, and I could hear the distraction in her voice even before I spoke. Hi, Mom, what's up? I'm actually in a meeting, so this needs to be quick. I have breast cancer, I said simply, because there was no gentle way to deliver that kind of news. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds. I know because I counted them, the way you count the space between lightning and thunder to measure how far away danger is. Oh my God, she finally said, and for a moment I thought I heard genuine concern in her voice. Mom, that's how bad is it? Stage 2. I start chemotherapy next month. Okay, she said, and I could hear her mind already racing ahead to logistics, to how this would affect her life rather than mine. Do you need me to come up? I mean, I have this huge project at work, and Richard's having issues with his business, but if you really need me. The offer hung in the air like a soap bubble, beautiful on the surface, but empty inside, ready to pop at the slightest pressure. No, I said quietly. Don't let me interrupt your life. Are you sure? Because I could maybe come for a weekend next month after this project wraps up. Next month. After her project wrapped up. As if cancer operated on her schedule. I'm sure, I said, and hung up before she could offer any more conditional support. That was the last real conversation we had for 3 years. The chemotherapy began in April. I'd researched it thoroughly, of course, read every medical journal article, joined online support groups, prepared myself for the battle ahead. But nothing really prepares you for the reality of poison coursing through your veins. Necessary poison that saves your life by nearly killing you first. The first session wasn't too bad. I drove myself to the oncology center, sat in the comfortable chair they provided, and watched the 4 drips slowly transfer the chemicals that would hopefully save my life. The nurses were kind, professional, encouraging. Do you have someone to drive you home? Asked Karen, the head nurse, as the session ended. I'm fine to drive myself, I said, though I was already feeling the first waves of nausea. What about next time? These treatments can be cumulative. You really should have someone here with you. I nodded and smiled, not wanting to admit that there was no one to call. Sarah hadn't visited. Emma was in college, focused on her sorority and her classes, and her young life that had no room for a sick grandmother. My few friends were acquaintances really, people from the bridge club and charity committees who would send flowers but wouldn't sit in a hospital waiting room. By the 3rd treatment, Karen had stopped asking about family. I could see the pity in her eyes, the way she lingered a little longer when checking my 4, the way she brought me extra blankets without being asked. Doesn't she have family? I overheard one nurse whisper to another as I dozed in my chair. A daughter somewhere, Karen replied quietly. Never seen her. The shame of that moment. Being pitted by strangers for my family's abandonment burned worse than any chemotherapy side effect. The treatments continued through summer and into fall. I lost my hair first, then my appetite, then what felt like my very essence. There were days when I was too weak to get out of bed, when the nausea was so overwhelming that I couldn't keep down even water. I learned to time my grocery shopping for the brief windows when I felt almost human, learned to prepare meals in advance for the days when I'd be too sick to cook. I called Sarah exactly once during this period, during week 6 when the chemotherapy had been particularly brutal, and I'd spent 3 days unable to keep down solid food. Mom. Her voice was bright, distracted. Hold on, let me just… Emma, turn that music down. Sorry, Emma's home for the weekend, and you know how kids are. Emma was home for the weekend. My granddaughter was visiting her mother, sitting in her living room, while her grandmother was dying alone an hour's drive away. I'm having a rough patch with the chemo, I said carefully. I was wondering if maybe you could visit this weekend. Just for a few hours. Oh, Mom, I wish I could, but Emma's only here until Sunday, and we have so many things planned. You know how it is when she comes home from college. We barely get any time together. They barely got any time together. While I had nothing but time, endless stretches of it filled with sickness and solitude. Maybe next weekend? She offered vaguely. Things should calm down by then. Next weekend came and went without a call. So did the weekend after that, and the one after that. The worst day came in October, during my 8th treatment. I'd been battling a particularly severe reaction to the new drug cocktail they'd started me on, and my blood counts had dropped to dangerous levels.
Dr.
Peterson had insisted I be admitted for observation. I spent 4 days in that hospital room, watching the empty chair beside my bed and listening to the sounds of other patients' visitors in the hallway. Flowers were delivered, conversations carried through thin walls, children's laughter echoed from the family lounge. My room stayed silent. On the third day, Karen found me crying, not from pain or fear, but from the crushing loneliness of fighting for my life, while my own daughter acted as if I'd already lost. "Honey," she said gently, sitting in the empty chair that should have held my daughter, "have you tried calling your family? Sometimes people don't know how to help during illness. They get scared and they stay away because they don't know what to say." I wanted to tell her that I'd tried, that I'd called and been dismissed, that my absence from my daughter's life was apparently less important than a college student's weekend visit. Instead, I just shook my head. "They have their own lives," I said, and Karen squeezed my hand with the kind of compassion that should have come from my own blood. The treatments ended in February, 11 months after they'd begun. I was officially in remission. My hair was starting to grow back in silver instead of the brown it had been, and I was slowly regaining my strength. I called Sarah to share the good news.
Mom.
"Oh my God, that's wonderful." Her enthusiasm sounded genuine, and for a moment I felt a flicker of hope that maybe we could rebuild what had been broken. "We should celebrate. Richard and I could drive up next weekend, take you out to dinner." "That would be nice," I said carefully. "Actually, wait, let me check my calendar. Oh, damn, we have that thing with Richard's clients next weekend. The weekend after is Emma's spring formal, and the weekend after that." Her voice trailed off as she clearly realized she was making excuses. "It's fine, Sarah," I said. "Don't worry about it." No, we'll figure something out. I promise." That promise joined all the others she'd made and broken over the years. Empty words meant to assuage her guilt rather than express genuine commitment. 2 weeks later, James called with news that would change everything. "Linda," he said, his voice heavy with concern, "I've been watching what's happened with Sarah during your treatment. I want you to know that I'm changing my will." James was my older brother, the successful one who'd built a real estate empire and never married, never had children of his own. He'd always been fond of Sarah and Emma, had sent generous birthday and graduation gifts, had welcomed them into his life with the warmth of a man who enjoyed being an uncle. "You don't need to do that," I protested. "Yes, I do. A daughter who abandons her mother during cancer treatment doesn't deserve to inherit what that mother's family built. When I die, everything goes to you, the penthouse, the properties, all of it." "James, I've already spoken to my lawyer. Sarah gets nothing. Not a penny, not a photograph, nothing. You survived cancer, Linda, but you also survived learning who your real family is." James died 6 months later, sudden heart attack, while he was reviewing property deals in his office. At his funeral, Sarah cried appropriately and accepted condolences graciously. She even delivered a lovely eulogy about what a wonderful uncle he'd been. She had no idea that he'd written her out of his life as completely as she'd written me out of mine. The will reading was a small affair, just me, Sarah, Emma, and James's lawyer in a conference room that smelled of leather and old money. When the lawyer announced that the penthouse and the bulk of James's estate was coming to me, Sarah looked genuinely surprised. "But what about Emma's college fund?" she asked. "Uncle James always said he'd help with her education." The lawyer consulted his notes. Mr. Whitfield left no provisions for Emma's education. The entire estate passes to Mrs. Linda Whitfield. I watched Sarah's face as the reality hit her. She'd been counting on James's money, had probably already made plans for it. The disappointment in her eyes was almost as satisfying as the cancer diagnosis had been devastating. After the reading, As we stood outside the lawyer's office, Sarah tried one more time. Mom, I know things have been difficult, but we're still family. Maybe now that you have this wonderful opportunity, we could try to rebuild our relationship. I looked at my daughter, this woman who had ignored my cancer but showed up to my brother's funeral, who had forgotten me during my chemotherapy but remembered me when there was money involved, and felt something cold and final settle in my chest. We'll see, I said noncommittally. 3 months later, I moved into the penthouse. 2 months after that, Sarah rang my doorbell for the first time in over 3 years. Now you understand why I felt no mercy when I closed that door in her face. Some betrayals are too complete for forgiveness, some absences too profound for explanation. Sarah thought she could waltz back into my life because I now had something she wanted. She was about to learn that the mother she'd abandoned during cancer treatment was gone forever, replaced by someone much more dangerous. Someone who remembered every empty day, every missed call, every moment of being treated like I was already dead. Someone who was very much alive and very ready for revenge. The penthouse was more than just real estate, it was a weapon, and I intended to use it with surgical precision. James had chosen well when he'd purchased the apartment 15 years earlier. Located on the 42nd floor of one of Manhattan's most exclusive buildings, it offered panoramic views of Central Park and the city's skyline, with floor-to-ceiling windows that made visitors feel like they were floating above the world. The interior was a masterpiece of understated elegance. Marble floors throughout, a gourmet kitchen with professional-grade appliances, 3 bedrooms including a master suite with a walk-in closet larger than most people's apartments, and a library that James had filled with first-edition books he'd never had time to read. But what made it truly valuable wasn't the luxury. It was the location, the exclusivity, the fact that apartments in this building rarely came on the market, and when they did, they sold for astronomical sums. According to my real estate agent, comparable units were selling for upwards of $8 million. $8 million that Sarah knew I now possessed, along with James's investment portfolio and his collection of rental properties throughout the city. Moving into the penthouse was like putting on armor. Every morning, I woke up surrounded by beauty and luxury that I'd never dreamed of possessing. Every evening, I stood at those windows looking down at the city where my daughter lived in increasingly desperate circumstances, and I felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had not only survived their enemy's attack, but emerged stronger than before. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah had abandoned me during cancer treatment partly because dealing with my illness was inconvenient, partly because she'd never been particularly close to me, but largely because she'd assumed I would die and she'd inherit whatever modest estate I might leave behind. Instead, I'd survived, grown stronger, and inherited a fortune that dwarfed anything she could have imagined. The first month in the penthouse was spent settling in and planning. I hired a decorator to update the apartment's color scheme. James had favored masculine browns and grays, while I preferred softer creams and blues that complemented my silver hair and made the space feel more feminine. I also installed a comprehensive security system with cameras in every common area, ostensibly for protection but really for documentation. I knew Sarah would eventually make her move, and when she did, I wanted evidence of everything she said and did. My new neighbors were exactly the kind of people Sarah desperately wanted to impress. Old money families, successful business people, a few celebrities who valued privacy above publicity. During my first building association meeting, I made sure to mention my daughter in casual conversation. I have a daughter who lives in the city, I told Mrs. Ellis, the building's unofficial social coordinator. Though we've been estranged recently. She didn't visit during my cancer treatment, you see. Some children just aren't equipped to handle their parents' mortality. The information spread through the building like wildfire. Nothing traveled faster through elite social circles than gossip about family dysfunction and the story of the ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned her mother during chemotherapy was particularly scandalous. By the time Sarah finally showed up at my door, half the building already knew she was the callous woman who'd left her mother to fight cancer alone. The day after I'd slammed the door in Sarah's face, she called my phone 17 times. I let every call go to voicemail, then listened to them with the detached interest of a scientist studying lab specimens. The first few messages were angry. "Mom, this is ridiculous. You can't just shut me out over a misunderstanding." The middle messages were pleading. "Please, Mom, let's talk about this like adults. I know I wasn't there as much as I should have been, but I'm here now." The final messages were desperate. "Mom, please pick up. Richard says we need to discuss the family assets. There might be tax implications you haven't considered." Richard says we need to discuss the family assets. There it was, the real reason for her sudden interest in reconciliation. Not love, not guilt, not genuine remorse for abandoning me during the worst period of my life. Money. I deleted all the messages without responding. 3 days later, flowers arrived, an elaborate arrangement of white roses and lilies that probably cost more than Sarah could afford. The card read, "With love and apologies. Your daughter, Sarah." I had the flowers delivered to the cancer center where I'd received treatment, with a note asking them to place them in the family lounge where other patients' relatives gathered while their loved ones underwent chemotherapy. The nurses recognized my name and understood the gesture immediately. A week after that, Sarah sent Emma. My granddaughter appeared at my door on a Thursday evening, looking nervous and guilty. Unlike her mother, Emma had always been a poor liar, and I could see the conflict written clearly across her young face. "Hi, Grandma," she said when I opened the door. "I was hoping we could talk." "Were you?" I asked, not inviting her in. "Or were you hoping to scout out the apartment for your mother?" Emma's cheeks flamed red. "That's not. I mean, Mom didn't send me exactly. I came because I think this whole situation is getting out of hand." "Do you?" I leaned against the doorframe, studying this beautiful young woman who had inherited my stubborn chin and my talent for rationalization. "Tell me, Emma, where were you when I was having chemotherapy?" "I was in college, Grandma. I'm sorry I didn't visit more, but I was so focused on my studies, and Mom said you wanted space to heal." "Your mother said I wanted space?" Emma nodded eagerly, clearly relieved to shift some blame to Sarah. "She said the chemotherapy was making you tired and emotional, and that it would be better if we gave you time to recover before visiting." The lie was so breathtaking in its audacity that I almost admired Sarah for it. She'd not only abandoned me during cancer treatment, she'd prevented her own daughter from visiting by claiming it was my choice. "I see," I said calmly. "And what does your mother want now?" Emma's composure cracked slightly.
She's worried about you.
Living alone in this big place, dealing with all of Uncle James's estate issues. She thinks maybe we could help. Help with what, specifically? Well, the taxes must be complicated and the maintenance fees on a place like this, and... Emma trailed off as she realized she was essentially asking about my finances. "Emma," I said gently, "your mother sent you here to find out how much money I have and whether I'm competent to manage it myself. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is about family concern." Emma burst into tears, the same kind of dramatic sobbing she'd perfected as a child when she'd been caught doing something wrong. "Grandma, please. I know Mom made mistakes, but she's sorry. And we really are struggling financially. Dad's business failed again, and they're behind on the mortgage, and I had to take out extra student loans." There it was. The truth beneath all the tears and manipulation. They weren't here because they loved me or regretted abandoning me. They were here because they needed money and thought I was their easiest target. "Emma," I said, my voice still gentle but absolutely firm, "your financial problems are not my responsibility. Your mother made choices, and choices have consequences. She chose not to be my daughter when I needed her most." I'm choosing not to be her mother now that she needs me most. I closed the door while she was still crying in the hallway. That evening, I poured myself a glass of James's vintage wine and stood at my windows watching the city lights twinkle below. Somewhere out there, Sarah was probably consoling her daughter, spinning new lies about my cruelty and unreasonableness. They had no idea that this was only the beginning. The next phase of my plan required patience and subtlety. I began attending social events in my building and the surrounding neighborhood, making sure to establish myself as a grieving cancer survivor whose ungrateful family had abandoned her in her time of need. At charity luncheons, I would mention casually how grateful I was for the oncology nurses who had been more supportive than my own daughter. At book club meetings, I would reference the loneliness of fighting cancer without family support. At building association gatherings, I would thank my neighbors for being the community I'd never had from my blood relatives. The story spread organically through Manhattan's interconnected social networks. Sarah's name was never mentioned directly, but people began to understand that somewhere in the city lived a woman callous enough to abandon her own mother during cancer treatment. When Sarah finally made her first tactical error, I was ready for it. It happened 6 weeks after I'd closed the door in her face. I was returning from dinner with Mrs. Ellis when I found Sarah in the building's lobby, arguing with a concierge. "I'm her daughter," Sarah was saying, her voice rising with frustration. "I just need to speak with her for 5 minutes." "Ma'am, as I've explained, I cannot give out information about residents or allow unauthorized access to the building," the concierge replied with professional calm. "Unauthorized access? She's my mother." "The same mother you didn't visit during her cancer treatment?" Mrs. Ellis said sweetly as we approached. "How interesting that you've suddenly remembered you have a mother now that she's inherited a penthouse." Sarah spun around, her face flushing red as she recognized the trap she'd walked into. Here she was, making a scene in front of my neighbors, proving everything I'd said about her character. "Mrs. Ellis, this is a private family matter." "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Ellis interrupted, "nothing is private once you abandon your family. The entire building knows what kind of daughter you are." I watched Sarah realize that her reputation in my new social circle was already destroyed before she'd even met most of these people. The humiliation in her eyes was almost as satisfying as the cancer remission had been hopeful. "Hello, Sarah," I said pleasantly. "Trying to visit again? How thoughtful. Though I notice you only think to visit when you need something." "Mom, please, can we just talk?" 5 minutes. We had 3 years to talk.
You weren't interested then.
I turned to the concierge. "Please make note that Sarah Moore is not authorized to visit my apartment or receive any information about my whereabouts." As I walked toward the elevator, Sarah called after me. "You can't cut me out forever. I'm your daughter. I have rights." I paused at the elevator doors and turned back with a smile that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Rights," I repeated. "You had the right to visit your mother during cancer treatment.
You chose not to exercise it.
I have the right to choose my family, and I'm exercising it now." The elevator doors closed on her shocked face, and I rode up to the 42nd floor feeling lighter than I had in years. Sarah thought she could pressure me into forgiveness, manipulate me into sharing my inheritance, shame me into accepting her back into my life. She was about to learn that the mother who had begged for her daughter's presence during chemotherapy was gone forever. In her place was someone much more dangerous, someone who had learned that family was a choice, not an obligation, and who had chosen to write her ungrateful daughter out of her life as completely as James had written her out of his will. The penthouse wasn't just my home now. It was my fortress, my command center, and my proof that some stories have happy endings, even if happiness comes at the expense of people who never deserved it in the first place. The key to destroying an enemy is not to attack them directly. It's to make them destroy themselves while you watch from a safe distance. Sarah was greedy, desperate, and had never been particularly bright when it came to reading people's motivations. Those weaknesses would become her downfall. My plan required three elements: hope, opportunity, and documentation. I needed Sarah to believe she could still win me over. I needed to provide her with chances to reveal her true character, and I needed evidence of everything she did and said. The hope came first. 2 weeks after the lobby confrontation, I had my lawyer, Elaine Harper, reach out to Sarah's attorney with a carefully crafted message. The call was allegedly about estate planning, specifically the need to update my will and power of attorney documents now that I'd inherited James's substantial assets. Mrs. Whitfield is considering various options for her estate distribution, Elaine told Sarah's lawyer. While their relationship has been strained, she hasn't made any final decisions about her daughter's inheritance. She's asked me to reach out about possibly including Sarah in the estate planning discussions. The message was deliberately ambiguous. It suggested that I might be softening toward Sarah, while also making clear that no decisions had been made. Most importantly, it created the impression that acting quickly might influence my choices. Sarah called within 2 hours of her lawyer, relaying the message. Mom, her voice was carefully controlled, trying to strike the right balance between humble and hopeful. I heard from my attorney that you're updating your estate plan. I was wondering if we could meet to discuss it. Were you? I kept my own voice neutral, neither encouraging nor dismissive. And what exactly would you like to discuss? Well, I know I haven't been the daughter you deserved, especially during your illness. I was hoping we could work on rebuilding our relationship. Maybe start slowly, with coffee or lunch. The offer sounded reasonable, even heartfelt. If I hadn't spent 3 years learning exactly who Sarah really was, I might have been touched by it. I suppose we could try lunch, I said after a long pause. Nothing elaborate. There's a small cafe near the building. That would be wonderful, Mom. When works for you. We arranged to meet the following Thursday at 1 p.m. at a quiet restaurant 2 blocks from my building. I chose the location carefully, close enough that I wouldn't be inconvenienced, public enough that Sarah couldn't make a scene, expensive enough that she'd feel uncomfortable paying if the bill somehow ended up being her responsibility. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table with a clear view of the entrance. Sarah appeared exactly on time, dressed in what was clearly her best outfit, but which probably represented a significant portion of her current wardrobe budget. Mom, she said, bending to kiss my cheek in a gesture that felt as artificial as it looked. You look wonderful. The penthouse life must agree with you. It's quite comfortable, I agreed, gesturing for her to sit. Though I imagine any home feels comfortable when you're not worried about abandoning the people who live there. Sarah's smile faltered momentarily, but she recovered quickly. I deserve that. I know I wasn't there for you the way I should have been. Weren't there at all, I corrected. Let's be precise about our terms. The waitress approached, and I ordered the most expensive entree on the menu along with a glass of wine that cost more than most people spent on an entire meal. Sarah ordered a salad and water. Mom, I want you to know how sorry I am, Sarah began once we were alone. I was dealing with my own problems. Richard's business was failing, Emma needed help with college applications, and I didn't know how to handle seeing you so sick. So, your solution was not to see me at all. It was wrong. I know that now. But I'm here now, and I want to make things right. I sipped my wine and studied her face. Sarah had always been a decent liar, but 3 years of financial stress had left her looking worn around the edges. I could see the calculation behind her eyes, the way she was measuring every word for maximum impact. Making things right is an interesting concept, I said finally. What exactly did you have in mind? I thought maybe we could start spending time together. I could visit regularly, help you with anything you need around the penthouse. Emma could visit too. She's been wanting to see you. Has she? The same Emma who couldn't find time to visit her grandmother during cancer treatment, but now wants to see the penthouse. Sarah's cheeks flushed, but she pressed on. She's young, Mom. Young people don't always understand how serious these things are. She's 19, not 9. At 19, I was working 2 jobs to pay for college. But I suppose different generations have different priorities. The barb hit home, and Sarah's carefully constructed facade cracked slightly. Look, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but I'm trying to fix things. Isn't that worth something? It might be, if I believed your motives were genuine. I signaled the waitress for another glass of wine. But we both know this isn't about fixing our relationship. This is about my inheritance. Sarah's mouth fell open in what I'm sure she thought was convincing surprise. How can you say that? I'm your daughter. You're a stranger who happens to share my DNA, I corrected. My daughter would have visited during chemotherapy. My daughter would have held my hand when I was scared. My daughter would have been there when I needed her most. I'm here now. Yes, you are. Now that I have money. How convenient. Sarah leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Mom, please. I know I failed you, but I'm desperate. Richard's business debts are crushing us. We might lose the house. Emma had to take out so many student loans that she'll be paying them off for decades. Finally, the truth. Not apologies or remorse, but financial desperation dressed up as family concern. And you think my inheritance should solve your problems? I think maybe Uncle James left you all that money partly because he knew you'd take care of the family, that you'd help Emma with college, help us get back on our feet. The audacity was breathtaking. Sarah was rewriting James's motivations to make her abandonment of me seem like part of some larger family plan. James left me his money because you abandoned me during cancer treatment, I said quietly. He told me so himself. He said a daughter who couldn't be bothered to visit her dying mother didn't deserve to inherit what that mother's family built. The color drained from Sarah's face. He said that? Those exact words. James watched you ignore me for 3 years, and he decided you'd written yourself out of the family. His will simply made it official. Sarah sat back in her chair, finally understanding that her assumptions about James's generosity had been completely wrong. There would be no easy inheritance, no guilt-driven handouts, no family money to solve her problems. But I'm trying to make amends, she said weakly. Are you? Or are you trying to manipulate me into giving you money? Both, Sarah admitted, apparently deciding that honesty might be more effective than continued lies. Yes, we need help, but I also genuinely want to rebuild our relationship. I see. And if I had no money? If James had left me nothing and I was still living in my old apartment, struggling on Social Security, would you be here then? Sarah's silence was answer enough. I finished my wine and placed the glass precisely in the center of my plate. Thank you for lunch, Sarah. It's been illuminating. Wait, where are you going? We haven't finished talking. We finished talking 3 years ago when you decided I wasn't worth your time. This was just you discovering that my time is no longer available to you. I stood to leave, then paused as if struck by a sudden thought. I'll go, I said slowly. I suppose it's possible that you could earn your way back into my good graces. Sarah's eyes lit up with desperate hope. How? What do you need? Nothing from you specifically. But I am getting older and managing James's estate is complex. I might need help with paperwork, financial documents, that sort of thing. It was the perfect bait, vague enough to seem legitimate, important enough to justify regular contact, and administrative enough to provide opportunities for Sarah to reveal her true intentions. I could help with that, Sarah said eagerly. I'm good with paperwork and I understand financial documents from Richard's business. Perhaps. Let me think about it. In the meantime, why don't you call me next week? We could discuss what kind of assistance I might need. I left Sarah at the table with the check, a deliberate power play that she couldn't protest without seeming petty. Over the next 2 weeks, I carefully cultivated Sarah's hope while providing her with just enough access to make her think she was making progress. I invited her to coffee once, then canceled at the last minute due to a medical appointment. I asked her to help me review some property documents, then decided I wasn't ready to share that information yet. Each interaction was designed to keep her invested while preventing her from gaining any real access to my affairs. More importantly, each conversation was recorded by the small device I carried in my purse, a precaution Elaine had suggested given Sarah's history of manipulation. The recordings revealed exactly what I'd expected. When Sarah thought she was making progress, she was warm and attentive. When frustrated by delays, she was calculating and cold. And when she talked to Richard between our meetings, conversations I could hear clearly. When she forgot to end our phone calls properly, she was explicit about her intentions. She's stringing me along. I heard her tell her husband after our third coffee meeting. But I think she's weakening. She mentioned needing help with estate documents. If I can get access to those papers, we'll know exactly what we're dealing with. Good, Richard replied. We need to know how much she's worth before we decide how much pressure to apply. Emma's tuition is due next month, and the mortgage company is making noises about foreclosure. Don't worry. I'll get what we need. Mom's always been sentimental about family. I just need to find the right angle. The right angle. As if my love for the daughter who'd abandoned me during cancer treatment was just another weakness to exploit.
Perfect.
By the end of the month, I had hours of recorded conversations proving that Sarah's reconciliation attempts were entirely motivated by greed. I also had documentation of her increasingly desperate financial situation and evidence of her husband's gambling debts that she'd failed to mention during our heart-to-heart lunch. Most importantly, I had Sarah exactly where I wanted her, invested enough in our relationship to take risks, desperate enough to make mistakes, and convinced enough of my gradual softening to let her guard down completely. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for her to spring it. Sarah thought she was playing me, manipulating the grieving cancer survivor into sharing her newfound wealth. She had no idea that every word she spoke was being recorded, every lie cataloged, every manipulation documented for future use. The daughter who had abandoned me during my darkest hours was about to discover that I had learned some very valuable lessons during those long nights in chemotherapy chairs. The most important lesson? Sometimes the best revenge is simply giving people enough rope to hang themselves. While Sarah schemed to gain access to my estate documents, I began the systematic destruction of her reputation in the social circles she desperately wanted to join. It was important that her downfall be as public as her abandonment of me had been private. Manhattan's upper-class social scene is surprisingly small and interconnected. The same people appear at charity galas, museum fundraisers, private clubs, and exclusive restaurants. They all know each other, or know someone who knows someone, and gossip travels through these networks faster than money through a politician's campaign fund. My entry into this world had been seamless, partly because of the penthouse address, and partly because I played the role of dignified cancer survivor perfectly. I was sympathetic without being pitiful, wealthy without being ostentatious, and mysterious enough about my family situation to make people curious. The curiosity was exactly what I needed. It started at a charity luncheon for the Metropolitan Museum. I was seated at a table with 5 other women, all wives of successful businessmen or independently wealthy widows like myself. The conversation naturally turned to family, children's careers, grandchildren's accomplishments, the usual competitive bragging disguised as maternal pride. "And what about your family, Linda?" asked Patricia Thornton, whose husband owned half of the restaurants in the Upper East Side. "Do you have children?" "I have a daughter," I said with carefully measured sadness. Though we're estranged. The admission created exactly the right amount of uncomfortable silence. In these circles, family estrangement was scandalous, something that happened to other people, never to anyone sitting at their table. "Oh my," Patricia said gently. "I'm so sorry. May I ask what happened?" "She abandoned me during my cancer treatment," I said simply, then took a sip of wine to let the words sink in. The silence that followed was profound. These were women who had dedicated their lives to charity work, who understood that family duty was the foundation of civilized society. The idea of abandoning a parent during cancer treatment was beyond their comprehension. "Abandoned you?" whispered Helen Morrison, whose own daughter was a successful pediatric surgeon. "During cancer?" "3 years of chemotherapy," I confirmed. "Not a single visit. Not even a phone call on the days when I was too sick to get out of bed." "But surely there was some misunderstanding," Patricia began.
No misunderstanding.
She was simply too busy with her own life to be bothered with her dying mother. I let that image settle in their minds, the picture of a daughter so callous that she couldn't spare time for her cancer-stricken mother. "How horrible," Helen said, her voice filled with genuine shock. "I can't imagine any of my children behaving that way." "Neither could I replied. Until it happened. Word of the conversation spread through the charity circuit like wildfire. Within a week, I was receiving invitations to dinner parties, book clubs, and cultural events from women who wanted to hear the full story. I accepted selectively, always choosing gatherings where the guest lists included people who might encounter Sarah in the future. At each event, I told the same story, with minor variations. The details never changed, those were too easy to verify, but I adjusted the emotional tone depending on my audience. With older women, I emphasized the loneliness and abandonment. With mothers, I focused on the incomprehensible cruelty of a child turning her back on a parent. With cancer survivors, I shared the particular horror of facing mortality without family support. The story resonated because it tapped into every parent's deepest fear, that they might raise a child capable of such heartless betrayal. 2 months into this campaign, Sarah made her first attempt to enter my new social circle. I was attending a gallery opening in Soho, making polite conversation with the curator, when I spotted Sarah across the room. She was dressed in what was obviously a borrowed outfit, too expensive for her current financial situation but not quite fitting properly, and she was working her way through the crowd with the determined smile of someone crashing a party. She approached my group with practiced confidence. "Excuse me," she said to the curator, "I couldn't help but notice you speaking with my mother." The curator, a sophisticated woman named Claire who had already heard my story through the charity network, looked Sarah up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Your mother?" Claire repeated, her tone suggesting she found the claim unlikely. "Linda Whitfield," Sarah confirmed, gesturing toward me with artificial warmth. "We've been working on rebuilding our relationship after some difficult years." "How interesting," Claire said coolly. "Your mother was just telling us about her experience with cancer treatment. She mentioned that her family wasn't particularly supportive during that time." Sarah's smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Well, family relationships are complicated, aren't they? Sometimes people misunderstand." "Misunderstand abandonment?" I interrupted, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet group. I wasn't aware that abandonment was open to interpretation. The people around us, art collectors, gallery owners, cultural influencers, all turned to witness what was clearly a family drama playing out in public. Sarah realized too late that she'd walked into an ambush. "Mom, please, this isn't the place for..." "Isn't it?" I asked pleasantly. "You chose to approach me in public, introduce yourself as my daughter to people who know exactly what kind of daughter you've been. Did you think they wouldn't be curious about the woman who left her mother to face cancer alone?" Sarah's face flushed red as she realized that everyone in earshot was staring at her with a mixture of curiosity and disgust. This was the woman they'd heard about, the heartless daughter who'd abandoned her dying mother. I think there's been some confusion, Sarah said desperately. I was dealing with my own problems. What problems could possibly be more important than your mother's cancer treatment? Asked Margaret Sterling, a prominent socialite who had just joined our group. Sarah opened and closed her mouth like a fish, unable to come up with any response that wouldn't make her look even worse. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, she finally managed. Oh no, I said with a smile that could have frozen champagne. You wanted to introduce yourself to my friends. Let them get to know you properly. I turned to address the group. This is Sarah Moore, my estranged daughter. She's the one I told you about, the one who couldn't find time to visit during my 3 years of chemotherapy. The collective intake of breath was audible. These people had heard the story, but seeing the actual perpetrator standing before them was different. They could see Sarah's expensive but ill-fitting clothes, her desperate expression, her obvious discomfort at being exposed. I should go, Sarah said quietly. Yes, I agreed. You should. You're quite good at leaving after all. Sarah fled the gallery while a dozen influential New Yorkers watched her retreat. By the next morning, the story of the confrontation had spread through the social network like a virus. Sarah Moore was now a known quantity in circles she desperately wanted to enter, known as the woman heartless enough to abandon her mother during cancer treatment. But I wasn't finished. Over the next month, I made sure to attend events where Sarah might appear. Charity auctions, museum openings, exclusive restaurant parties, anywhere she might try to network or social climb, I was there first, inoculating the crowd against her presence. The pattern was always the same. I would arrive early, establish myself with the key influencers, and casually mention my daughter's abandonment in the context of discussing family loyalty or the importance of supporting cancer research. By the time Sarah appeared, if she appeared, the room was already predisposed against her. The social guillotine fell swiftly and completely. Invitations stopped coming. Phone calls weren't returned. Business contacts dried up. Sarah found herself shut out of the very circles she'd hoped to enter through association with my newfound wealth and status. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source: Emma. My granddaughter called on a Tuesday evening, her voice thick with tears. Grandma Linda, I need to talk to you about Mom. What about her, dear? I know you two are fighting, but some of my friends' parents have been saying things about how she treated you during your cancer. They're saying she never visited, never helped, just left you alone. Emma's voice cracked with emotion. Is it true? Did Mom really abandon you when you were sick? The question hung in the air between us. This was the moment I'd been building toward, the moment when Sarah's own daughter would be forced to confront the truth about her mother's character. What do you think, Emma? I asked gently. In 3 years of treatment, how many times did you see your mother visit me? How many times did she take me to appointments or sit with me during chemotherapy? The silence stretched long enough for Emma to count in her head, to realize that the number was 0. Oh my God, she whispered. Oh my God, it's true. She really did leave you alone. Yes, she did. But why? How could she do that to her own mother? You'd have to ask her that question. Emma was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was filled with shame and confusion. Grandma, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. She told me you wanted space to heal, that visitors would be too stressful. I believed her. I know you did, sweetheart. You were young and trusting. You believed what your mother told you. I could have come on my own. I could have driven up from college, could have called, could have done something. But I trusted that she knew what was best. Emma began to cry. Not the manipulative tears she'd used when begging me to reconcile with her mother, but the genuine anguish of a young woman realizing she'd been lied to about something fundamental. I failed you too, she sobbed. I'm just as bad as she is.
No, Emma.
You were manipulated by someone you trusted. There's a difference between being deceived and choosing to deceive others. What can I do? How can I make this right? The question I'd been waiting for. The opportunity to drive the final wedge between Sarah and the daughter who had been her strongest advocate. You can make your own choices now, I said gently. You're old enough to decide what kind of person you want to be, what kind of family relationships you want to have. You don't have to let your mother's failures define your own character. After Emma hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my penthouse windows, looking down at the glittering city below. Somewhere out there, Sarah was about to have the most difficult conversation of her life, explaining to her own daughter why she'd lied about abandoning her cancer-stricken mother. The social destruction was complete. Sarah's reputation in any circle that mattered was thoroughly ruined. Her own daughter now knew the truth about her character. The business contacts she'd hoped to make through association with my wealth had evaporated before they could form. But this was still only the beginning. Sarah had made one crucial error in her calculations. She'd assumed that my desire for revenge was emotional rather than strategic. She thought that if she could manipulate my feelings, guilt, loneliness, maternal love, she could even. She had no idea that I'd moved far beyond emotion into the realm of cold, methodical planning. The social humiliation had been satisfying, but it was just the appetizer. The main course was still to come. Sarah's desperation reached its peak 6 weeks after the gallery confrontation, by which point her social reputation was in ruins and her financial situation had become critical. Richard's gambling debts were mounting faster than his ability to pay them, Emma's college tuition was overdue, and the mortgage company had begun foreclosure proceedings on their house. I knew all this because Emma had begun calling me regularly, partly out of genuine remorse for her years of absence, and partly because she needed someone to talk to about her family's disintegration. During these conversations, I learned that Sarah and Richard were fighting constantly about money, that they'd already sold most of their valuable possessions, and that Sarah was making increasingly wild claims about the inheritance she was certain to receive once she worked things out with me. She keeps saying Uncle James meant for the money to help the whole family, Emma told me during one of our phone calls. She says you're just grieving and confused, and that once you think about it logically, you'll realize she was right to give you space during your treatment. The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity. Sarah had convinced herself, or was trying to convince herself, that abandoning me during cancer treatment had somehow been the right choice, and that my current anger was just temporary grief that would pass once I came to my senses. What do you think about that? I asked Emma. I think she's lying to herself because the truth is too awful to admit, Emma replied with a clarity that sometimes comes from having your illusions shattered. I think she knows she was wrong, but she can't face it, so she's making up stories to justify what she did. My granddaughter was growing wiser by the day, learning hard lessons about human nature that would serve her well in life. It was Emma who inadvertently provided me with the perfect trap for her mother. Grandma, she said during one of our conversations, Mom keeps asking me if I know anything about your estate planning. She wants to know if you've updated your will, who your lawyer is, whether you've made any decisions about inheritance. What do you tell her? Nothing, because I don't know anything. But she keeps pushing. She even asked me to try to get information from you during our calls. And will you? No, Emma said firmly. I'm not going to spy on you for her. I've done enough wrong already. But Sarah's questions gave me an idea for the perfect bait. The next week, I arranged to meet Sarah for coffee at a cafe near the penthouse. I arrived early and chose a table where I could spread out papers naturally, making sure the most important document was visible, but not obviously displayed. The document was a masterpiece of legal-looking fiction that Elaine Harper had helped me create. Titled Estate Planning Draft, Confidential, it contained just enough real information to seem authentic, while including provisions that would be irresistible to someone like Sarah. The fake will named Sarah as the sole beneficiary of my estate, contingent on her demonstrating renewed commitment to family relationships. It specified that she would inherit not just the penthouse, but all of James's properties and investments, worth approximately $12 million total. Most importantly, it included a clause stating that if I died or became incapacitated before finalizing the will, the draft document would serve as evidence of my intentions. When Sarah arrived, I was reviewing the papers with what appeared to be intense concentration. "Mom, you look stressed," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "Is everything all right?" "Estate planning is more complicated than I expected," I said, shuffling the papers in a way that gave her a clear view of the fake will's header. "James left me more assets than I realized, and the tax implications are staggering." Sarah's eyes locked onto the document like a hawk spotting prey. I could see her reading the visible portions, her breathing quickening as she processed what she was seeing. "Maybe I could help," she offered, her voice carefully casual. "I helped Richard with his business paperwork for years. I understand legal documents." "I don't know," I said, appearing to consider the offer. "These are very personal matters." "Mom, I'm your daughter. Who else would you trust with something this important?" The irony of that statement, coming from someone who'd abandoned me during cancer treatment, was almost too perfect. "I suppose you're right," I said after a moment. "But I'm not ready to share everything yet. Let me think about it." I gathered the papers carefully, making sure Sarah had seen enough to fuel her desperation, but not enough to satisfy her curiosity. The draft will disappeared into my purse, but I could see that Sarah's mind was racing with possibilities. Over the next week, Sarah called me daily. Each conversation circled around the same theme: her willingness to help with estate planning, her concern about tax implications, her suggestion that family decisions should be made with family input. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding estate planning," she said during one call. "Maybe we should sit down with your lawyer together. Two heads are better than one, especially when it comes to something this complex." "Perhaps," I said noncommittally, "though I'm not sure you'd understand the documents. Some of them are quite technical." The challenge to her intelligence was deliberate. Sarah had always been sensitive about her education, having dropped out of college to marry Richard and never quite feeling as smart as she pretended to be. "I think you might be surprised by what I can understand," she said with an edge to her voice. "We'll see." 2 days later, I provided Sarah with the opportunity she'd been waiting for. "I need to run to the pharmacy to pick up some prescriptions," I told her during one of her visits to the penthouse. "Would you mind waiting here? I'll be back in 20 minutes. "Of course, Mom. Take your time." I made a show of gathering my purse and coat, then paused at the door as if struck by a sudden thought. "Oh, I left some estate documents on the kitchen table. Could you keep an eye on them? I don't want the cleaning lady to accidentally move them." "Absolutely. I'll make sure nothing gets disturbed." I left the penthouse and rode the elevator down to the lobby, where I positioned myself behind a pillar with a clear view of the building's entrance. But I wasn't waiting to see if Sarah would leave. I was giving her exactly enough time to find and copy the documents I'd left strategically placed throughout the apartment. The fake will was on the kitchen table, along with equally fictional power of attorney forms and property transfer documents. Hidden cameras throughout the penthouse were recording everything Sarah did while I was gone. 25 minutes later, I returned to find Sarah sitting calmly in the living room, reading a magazine. "Everything quiet while I was gone?" I asked. "Perfectly quiet. Your documents are exactly where you left them." I checked the kitchen table, where the papers appeared untouched. But the hidden cameras would tell a different story. They would show Sarah photographing every document with her phone, then carefully replacing everything exactly as she'd found it. More importantly, they would record what she did next. Over the following week, Sarah's behavior became increasingly erratic. She called me multiple times a day, sometimes drunk, always fishing for information about my intentions. She showed up at the penthouse unannounced, claiming to be concerned about my health. She even tried to befriend my neighbors, hoping to gather intelligence about my activities. But the most telling evidence came from the phone calls she didn't know I could hear. During one of our conversations, Sarah thought she'd hung up properly, but had actually only pressed the speaker button. I listened as she immediately dialed another number. "Richard, it's me. I got the information we needed."
About time.
"What does the will say?" "Everything comes to me. The penthouse, the properties, all of it. $12 million total."
Jesus.
"And what's the catch?" "I have to demonstrate renewed commitment to family relationships, but that's just lawyer language. The important thing is that if she dies or becomes incompetent before the will is finalized, this draft serves as evidence of her intentions." "So, we just wait for her to die?" "We wait, or we help things along. She's already had cancer once. These things have a way of coming back." The casual discussion of my potential death was chilling, but it was exactly the kind of evidence I needed to destroy them completely. 3 days later, Sarah made her fatal mistake. I had arranged to meet her at the penthouse to discuss estate planning, but I called at the last minute to cancel due to a supposed medical appointment.
I'm so sorry, dear, I said.
"Dr. Peterson wants to see me immediately. Some irregularity in my blood work that he wants to discuss."
"Oh no, Mom.
"Is it serious?" "I hope not. But you know how these things can be with cancer survivors. We'll have to postpone our meeting." "Of course. Health comes first." What Sarah didn't know was that I was actually in Elaine Harper's office, watching the penthouse security monitors as my daughter let herself into my home using the spare key I'd given her weeks earlier. The cameras captured everything in high definition: Sarah entering the apartment, going directly to my bedroom, and opening the safe where she knew I kept important documents. She removed the fake estate planning papers and spent 20 minutes photographing them again, this time paying special attention to signature pages and notarization requirements. But then she did something I'd been hoping for, but hadn't dared to expect. Sarah took out a pen and began practicing my signature on a piece of blank paper. After several attempts, she found a rhythm that satisfied her, then carefully forged my name on one of the power of attorney documents. The cameras captured every stroke, every pause, every moment of criminal intent. When she was finished, Sarah returned most of the documents to the safe. But she kept the forged power of attorney form, slipping it into her purse with the confidence of someone who believed she'd just solved all her financial problems. Within hours, Sarah was at her bank, attempting to use the forged document to gain access to what she thought were my accounts. She had no idea that the account numbers on the fake documents led to empty accounts Elaine had created specifically for this trap. She also had no idea that the bank had been alerted to watch for suspicious activity involving my estate. The moment Sarah presented the forged power of attorney, the bank's fraud protocols activated. Instead of accessing money that didn't exist, she found herself facing questions from security personnel who had been trained to spot elder abuse and document forgery. "Ma'am, this document requires verification," the bank manager explained. "We'll need to speak directly with Mrs. Whitfield before processing any transactions." "She's in the hospital," Sarah lied smoothly. "That's why she gave me power of attorney. She's too ill to handle financial matters herself." "I understand. But bank policy requires direct contact with account holders for transactions of this nature."
"Which hospital is she in?"
"We can arrange a bedside verification." Sarah's story began to unravel as she tried to explain why direct verification wasn't possible. The more questions she answered, the more obvious it became that she was attempting to access accounts without proper authorization. By the time Sarah left the bank empty-handed and increasingly panicked, Detective Ryan Calloway was already reviewing the video evidence Elaine had provided, hours of footage showing Sarah entering my home without permission, practicing my signature, and forging legal documents. The trap had been sprung perfectly. Sarah thought she was on the verge of solving all her financial problems. Instead, she had just committed multiple felonies while being recorded by high-definition security cameras. All that remained was to let her dig the hole a little deeper before the law came calling. And I knew exactly how to ensure she kept digging. The beauty of watching your enemies destroy themselves is that you don't have to lift a finger. You just have to be patient enough to let them make the mistakes that will bury them. Sarah's forged power of attorney had failed at the bank, but instead of realizing she'd walked into a trap, she interpreted the rejection as a temporary setback. Her desperation had reached the point where rational thinking was no longer possible. I knew this because Emma kept me informed about her mother's increasingly erratic behavior. She's convinced that someone at the bank is working against her, Emma told me during one of our phone calls. She says they're probably friends with you, that you've poisoned them against her somehow. What does she plan to do about it? She's talking about going directly to your lawyer, bypassing the bank entirely. She thinks if she can get the estate transferred directly to her name, she can deal with the banking issues later.
Perfect.
Elaine Harper was expecting exactly this kind of escalation. 2 days later, Sarah called to arrange another meeting at the penthouse. Her voice carried a manic energy that I recognized from my own desperate moments during chemotherapy, the sound of someone clinging to hope despite overwhelming evidence that their situation was hopeless. "Mom, I think I've figured out a solution to your estate planning problems," she said. "Instead of going through banks and dealing with all their bureaucracy, why don't we work directly with your lawyer to transfer ownership of the major assets? That way you'll have peace of mind, and I can help manage everything without all the complications." Transfer ownership to whom? Well, to me, of course, as your heir. It would simplify everything and protect you from having to deal with financial stress. The audacity was breathtaking. Sarah was essentially asking me to sign over my entire inheritance while she thought she was being clever about it. "That's an interesting idea," I said carefully. "Let me think about it." "What's to think about? You've already decided I should inherit everything. I saw the draft will. This would just make it official and protect you from tax complications." There it was, the admission that she'd been snooping through my estate documents. Exactly the kind of statement that would be useful in court. "I suppose we could meet to discuss it," I said. "But I want everything properly documented. No handwritten notes or informal agreements." "Of course. We should do this right, with proper legal documents and witnesses." Sarah was so focused on getting access to my money that she wasn't thinking clearly about what she was proposing. She wanted legal documents transferring ownership of assets to her, which would require either my genuine consent or forged signatures that could be easily detected by forensic experts. Since she'd already demonstrated her willingness to forge my signature, I was confident I knew which path she'd choose. We arranged to meet at the penthouse the following Tuesday at 2 p.m. I made sure to mention that my cleaning lady would be there until 3 o'clock, creating a sense of urgency that would pressure Sarah into making hasty decisions. On Tuesday morning, I reviewed the setup one final time with Elaine Harper and Detective Calloway. The penthouse was wired for both audio and video recording, with backup systems to ensure nothing would be missed. The documents Sarah would attempt to use were already prepared, elaborate fakes that looked authentic, but contained enough legal flaws to ensure they'd be thrown out of any legitimate court. Most importantly, Detective Calloway and 2 backup officers were positioned in an unmarked van outside the building, ready to respond within minutes of my signal. "Are you sure you want to handle the confrontation yourself?" Elaine asked. "We could have the officers arrest her the moment she attempts forgery." "No," I said firmly. "I want her to understand exactly what she's done and why she's being punished for it. 3 years of abandonment deserve more than a simple arrest." Sarah arrived precisely on time, carrying a briefcase that she clearly thought made her look professional and prepared. She'd dressed carefully for the occasion, a conservative navy suit that was probably left over from her working days, paired with jewelry that was trying too hard to suggest success. "Mom, she said, kissing my cheek with the same artificial warmth she'd been displaying for months. You look wonderful. Ready to get this paperwork sorted out. As ready as I can be, I replied, gesturing toward the dining room where I'd arranged the fake documents on the mahogany table. Though I have to admit, I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the legal complexity. Sarah's eyes lit up as she saw the papers spread across the table. Don't worry, I'll walk you through everything. These estate transfers are actually quite straightforward once you understand the process. She opened her briefcase and pulled out her own set of documents, property transfer forms, power of attorney papers, and what appeared to be a notarization kit complete with official-looking stamps and seals. Where did you get all this? I asked, though I already knew the answer from Detective Calloway's investigation. I had my lawyer prepare everything, she lied smoothly. He said it would be more efficient if we had all the paperwork ready to sign today. Sarah's lawyer was actually a notary service she'd found online, run by someone who specialized in questionable document preparation for desperate clients. The man had a history of skating close to the edge of legality, and Detective Calloway was already building a case against him for facilitating fraud. Shall we start with the property transfers? Sarah asked, pulling out a chair and gesturing for me to sit. These forms will transfer ownership of the penthouse and James's other properties directly to me, which will simplify the estate process and save thousands in probate costs. I sat down and pretended to study the documents she placed in front of me. They were impressive-looking fakes, complete with legal-sounding language and official stamps, but they contained enough errors to ensure they'd never hold up in court. This seems very comprehensive, I said. But shouldn't my lawyer review these before I sign anything? Mom, these are standard forms. Your lawyer would just charge you thousands of dollars to tell you the same thing I'm telling you for free, that this is the smartest way to handle your estate. Sarah was so focused on her goal that she wasn't paying attention to my reactions. She couldn't see that I was deliberately stalling, asking questions designed to get her to reveal more about her intentions. What about Emma's inheritance? I asked. Shouldn't these documents include provisions for her education? Emma will be fine, Sarah said dismissively. Once I have control of the estate, I can make sure she gets what she needs. But having everything in my name first will prevent tax complications and legal challenges. Legal challenges from whom? Sarah paused, clearly not having thought through this part of her story. Well, you know how these things can be. Distant relatives, opportunistic lawyers, people who might try to claim they're entitled to something. The irony was perfect. Sarah was describing exactly what she was doing while pretending to protect me from people like herself. I suppose that makes sense, I said, picking up a pen. Where do I sign? Sarah's breathing quickened as she realized I was actually going to cooperate. She pointed to signature lines on multiple documents, her finger trembling slightly with excitement. Here and initial here, she said rapidly. Then we'll need the power of attorney form signed and notarized. I held the pen over the first document, then hesitated. Sarah, can I ask you something? Of course, Mom. What is it? Where were you when I was dying? The question hit her like a physical blow. Sarah's face went white, and she stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. What do you mean? You know exactly what I mean. Where were you during my cancer treatment? Where were you when I was too sick to get out of bed? Where were you when I was scared and alone and needed my daughter? Mom, we've been through this. I was dealing with my own problems. No, I interrupted, setting down the pen. You were avoiding me because taking care of a sick parent was inconvenient. You wrote me off as already dead, so you wouldn't have to feel guilty about abandoning me. Sarah's carefully constructed facade began to crack. That's not true. I wanted to help, but you seem to want space. I never wanted space for my daughter. I wanted my daughter to care enough to show up. I'm here now, Sarah said desperately. I'm trying to help you now. Are you? Or are you trying to steal from me? The accusation hung in the air between us like smoke from a gun. Sarah's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Let me tell you what's really happening here, I continued, my voice deadly calm. You abandoned me during the worst period of my life, then showed up the moment you heard I'd inherited money. You've spent months manipulating me, lying to me, and plotting to gain control of my assets. And now you're sitting in my home trying to get me to sign forged documents that would transfer my entire inheritance to you. They're not forged, Sarah protested weakly. Really? Then you won't mind if I call my real lawyer to verify their authenticity. Sarah's face crumbled as she realized her scheme was unraveling. Mom, please, you don't understand. We're desperate. Richard's gambling debts, Emma's tuition, the mortgage. We're going to lose everything. And you thought the solution was to steal from the mother you abandoned during cancer treatment. I wasn't trying to steal. What would you call it? You broke into my home, copied my personal documents, practiced forging my signature, and now you're trying to trick me into signing papers that would give you control of millions of dollars I inherited from a brother who specifically wrote you out of his will because of how you treated me. Each accusation landed like a hammer blow. Sarah began to cry, not the manipulative tears she'd used before, but the genuine anguish of someone who had finally been caught. I'm sorry, she sobbed. I know I was wrong, but I didn't know what else to do. We're going to lose the house. Emma might have to drop out of college. Richard says if we don't pay his debt soon, bad things might happen. So, you decided to commit multiple felonies against your own mother? I thought maybe if I could just get access to some of the money, I could pay off the debts and then work out a proper arrangement with you later. The admission was exactly what I needed. Sarah had just confessed to breaking and entering, forgery, and attempted fraud while being recorded by multiple cameras. Sarah, I said gently, do you remember what you told Richard about my health? About helping things along if I didn't die naturally? Her face went ashen. You heard that. I heard everything. Every lie you told Emma about why you didn't visit during my treatment. Every conversation with Richard about my money. Every plan to steal from me, or worse. Sarah stared at me in horror as she realized the scope of her exposure. She thought she was manipulating a sick old woman, but she'd actually been confessing her crimes to someone who was documenting everything. What are you going to do? She whispered. I walked to the window and looked down at the street below, where Detective Calloway was waiting in his unmarked car. I'm going to give you exactly what you deserve, I said, pulling out my phone. Mom, please don't. I pressed a single number on my phone, sending the predetermined signal to Detective Calloway. Linda Whitfield, 4201, Park Avenue, I said when he answered. It's time. Sarah began to hyperventilate as she realized what was happening. She tried to gather up the forged documents, but I calmly stepped between her and the table. Leave them, I said. They're evidence now. Within 3 minutes, I heard the elevator ding in the hallway outside. Sarah looked toward the door like a trapped animal, but there was nowhere to run. The knock was professional and courteous. Mrs. Whitfield? Detective Calloway, NYPD. We spoke earlier. I opened the door to admit Detective Calloway and 2 uniformed officers. Sarah had collapsed into a chair, all fight drained out of her. Sarah Moore? Detective Calloway asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah nodded mutely. Mrs. Moore, you're under arrest for breaking and entering, forgery, attempted fraud, and elder abuse. You have the right to remain silent. As the detective read Sarah her rights, I watched my daughter's life collapse around her. The handcuffs looked surprisingly delicate on her wrists, but their symbolic weight was enormous. Mom, Sarah said as the officers prepared to lead her away. Please don't do this. Think about Emma. Think about the family. I looked at this woman who had abandoned me during cancer treatment, lied to her own daughter about my wishes, forged my signature, and plotted to steal my inheritance, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. I did think about family, Sarah. For 3 years, I thought about how my family had abandoned me. Now it's time for my family to think about the consequences of that choice. As they led her toward the elevator, Sarah turned back one more time. I'm still your daughter, she said desperately. My daughter died 3 years ago in a hospital room. You're just a criminal who happens to share my name. The elevator doors closed on her stunned face, and for the first time in years, my penthouse was truly peaceful. The trial of Sarah Moore began on a bitter January morning, with snow falling steadily on the courthouse steps and a wind that seemed to cut through even the thickest winter coats. I arrived precisely at 8:30 a.m., wearing my finest black wool coat over a burgundy suit, my silver hair perfectly styled, my grandmother's pearls gleaming at my throat. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a dignified woman who had survived cancer and betrayal, and who now demanded justice. The media attention was modest but steady. Local news stations had picked up the story as an example of elder abuse within families, and several reporters were stationed outside the courthouse hoping for statements from the principals involved. Inside, the courtroom was perhaps half full, mostly with court personnel, a few journalists, and the scattered observers who attend trials out of curiosity or civic duty. Emma sat in the back row, looking pale and torn between loyalty to her mother and guilt over her grandmother's ordeal. I took my seat in the front row, directly behind the prosecution table where Assistant District Attorney Patricia Wells was organizing her files with methodical precision. Patricia was a seasoned prosecutor in her 40s who specialized in white-collar crimes and elder abuse cases. During our preparation sessions, she'd made it clear that Sarah's case was one of the most clear-cut examples of family financial exploitation she'd ever seen. Sarah entered the courtroom in handcuffs, flanked by 2 bailiffs. 3 months in jail awaiting trial had changed her appearance dramatically. Her blonde hair had grown out, showing gray roots she could no longer afford to color. She'd lost weight, and the orange jumpsuit hung loose on her diminished frame. Most tellingly, the confident arrogance that had characterized her attempts to manipulate me was gone, replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone who had finally grasped the magnitude of their situation. Her court-appointed attorney, David Preston, was a competent enough lawyer but clearly overworked and underfunded. He'd attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but I had instructed Patricia to reject any offer that didn't include significant prison time. Some crimes, I told Patricia, require punishment that matches their moral weight, not just their legal classification. Judge Thomas Keating called the court to order with the brisk efficiency of someone who had presided over thousands of criminal cases. He was known for running a tight courtroom and having little patience for dramatics or delays. Patricia's opening statement was a masterpiece of prosecutorial precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, she began, this case is about the ultimate betrayal, a daughter who abandoned her mother during cancer treatment, then returned years later to steal the inheritance that abandonment had cost her. She outlined the charges systematically, breaking and entering multiple counts of forgery, attempted fraud, and elder abuse. Each charge was supported by overwhelming evidence, security footage, recorded conversations, forensic analysis of forged signatures, and witness testimony that would paint a comprehensive picture of Sarah's crimes. You will see video evidence of the defendant breaking into her mother's home and forging legal documents, Patricia continued. You will hear recordings of her discussing how to steal her mother's assets and even speculating about hastening her mother's death. This is not a family dispute. This is a calculated criminal conspiracy targeting an elderly cancer survivor by the one person who should have been protecting her. David Preston's opening statement attempted to portray Sarah as a desperate mother driven to poor choices by financial pressure and family dysfunction. Sarah Moore is not a criminal mastermind, Preston argued. She's a struggling mother who made terrible decisions when faced with losing her home and her daughter's education. Yes, she broke the law, but she did so out of desperation, not malice. We ask you to consider the circumstances that drove her to these actions and to show mercy for a woman who has already lost everything. The defense strategy was clear. Acknowledge the crimes but blame them on circumstances rather than character. It was Preston's only viable approach given the overwhelming evidence, but it carried significant risks. By admitting Sarah's guilt while asking for sympathy, he was essentially conceding the prosecution's case, while hoping the jury would ignore the most damning evidence of her callousness. The prosecution's case unfolded over 4 days, each piece of evidence more devastating than the last. Detective Calloway testified about the investigation, explaining how Sarah's pattern of behavior had escalated from manipulation to outright fraud. His testimony was calm, professional, and utterly damning. The defendant had been systematically documenting her mother's assets and legal arrangements, he explained. We found evidence that she had been planning this fraud for months, waiting for the right opportunity to execute it. The security company technician who had installed my cameras testified about the footage captured during Sarah's break-ins, walking the jury through video evidence that showed her entering my home without permission, copying documents, and practicing forgery. The defendant spent approximately 40 minutes in the apartment during the first unauthorized entry, he explained. The cameras captured her photographing documents, testing different pens for signature forgery, and even practicing Mrs. Whitfield's signature on multiple pieces of paper. Elaine Harper, my attorney, testified about the fake estate documents we had created to trap Sarah, explaining how the obvious legal flaws would have made them worthless in any legitimate proceeding. These documents were designed to look authentic to a layperson while containing enough errors to ensure they would never be legally binding, she explained. They were bait, essentially, to document the defendant's willingness to commit fraud when she thought she could benefit from it. But the most powerful testimony came from an unexpected source, Emma. My granddaughter had been subpoenaed by the prosecution as a witness to Sarah's behavior and statements during the period leading up to her arrest. Emma was 19 years old, but she looked younger as she sat in the witness box, her hands trembling as she was sworn in. Emma, can you describe your relationship with your grandmother during her cancer treatment? Patricia asked gently. Emma's voice was barely audible. I didn't see her. Mom told me that Grandma wanted space to heal, that visitors would be too stressful for her. Did you ever question this explanation? Not at the time. I was in college and I trusted what Mom told me. I thought Grandma really did want to be left alone. When did you learn that wasn't true? Emma began to cry, not the dramatic sobbing she'd used when begging me for reconciliation, but the quiet tears of genuine shame. When Grandma told me the truth, she said Mom never visited, never called, never helped with anything. For 3 years, while Grandma was fighting cancer, Mom just abandoned her. How did that make you feel? Horrified. Ashamed. I realized I'd been lied to about something so important, and I'd failed my grandmother when she needed family most. Preston objected that Emma's feelings weren't relevant to the criminal charges, but Judge Keating allowed the testimony to continue. The jury could see exactly what Sarah's lies had cost, not just her relationship with me, but her relationship with her own daughter. Emma, did your mother ever discuss your grandmother's inheritance with you? All the time. She kept saying that Uncle James had meant for the money to help the whole family, that Grandma was just being stubborn and would eventually come around. She said once she got control of the estate, she'd make sure I could finish college without student loans. Did she ever discuss specific plans for accessing your grandmother's assets? Emma looked directly at Sarah, who was staring at the table in front of her, unable to meet her daughter's eyes. She said she was working on getting power of attorney, and that once she had that, she could handle all of Grandma's financial affairs. She said it would be better for everyone because Grandma was getting old and might not make good decisions about money. The testimony painted a picture of months of premeditation, with Sarah systematically planning to gain control of my assets while lying to her own daughter about her intentions. When I took the witness stand on the fourth day, I was ready. I had been preparing for this moment since the day Sarah first rang my penthouse doorbell, and I intended to make sure the jury understood exactly what kind of person she really was. Patricia guided me through my testimony with professional skill, starting with my cancer diagnosis and treatment. Mrs. Whitfield, can you describe what your relationship with your daughter was like before your cancer diagnosis? We weren't particularly close, I said honestly, but I thought we had a normal mother-daughter relationship. I helped her financially when she needed it, spent holidays with her family, tried to be supportive of her choices. How did that change when you were diagnosed with cancer? She disappeared from my life completely. No visits, no phone calls, no offers of help. I fought cancer alone while my daughter acted as if I had already died. How did that make you feel? I paused, not because I needed to think about the answer, but because I wanted the jury to understand the weight of what I was about to say. Abandoned.
Betrayed.
Like I had raised a stranger who was capable of leaving her mother to die alone. And when did Sarah reappear in your life? The day she learned I had inherited my brother's penthouse and estate. She showed up at my door after 3 years of silence, pretending to want reconciliation while actually wanting access to my money. Patricia played selected portions of the recordings I had made of Sarah's conversations, and I watched the jury's faces as they heard my daughter discussing my potential death as a business opportunity. The cross-examination was brutal, but expected. Preston tried to paint me as a vindictive woman who had deliberately entrapped Sarah, but every attack only reinforced the strength of our case. Mrs. Whitfield, isn't it true that you deliberately created fake documents to entrap your daughter? I created documents that allowed my daughter to reveal her true intentions. She chose to forge my signature and attempt fraud. Those were her choices, not mine. Didn't you manipulate this entire situation to punish Sarah for what you perceived as abandonment during your illness? Mr. Preston, there was no perception involved. Sarah abandoned me during cancer treatment. That's not an opinion. It's a documented fact. 3 years, no visits, no help, no concern for my welfare. She chose to write me out of her life when I was vulnerable. I simply chose to keep her out when she decided she wanted back in. Preston tried for an hour to crack my testimony, but every question only highlighted Sarah's abandonment and betrayal. By the time I stepped down from the witness stand, it was clear that the jury believed my version of events completely. The defense's case was weak and desperate. Preston called character witnesses who testified to Sarah's previous good reputation as a mother and community member, but their testimonials rang hollow against the audio recordings of her criminal planning. Sarah's former employer spoke about her work ethic and reliability. Her daughter's former teachers praised her involvement in school activities, and neighbors described her as a caring mother who always put Emma first. But none of this could overcome the fact that the jury had heard Sarah discussing my potential death as a financial opportunity and seen video of her forging my signature. Preston made the crucial error of putting Sarah on the stand in her own defense. Sarah maintained that her actions had been motivated by desperation rather than greed, that she had genuinely believed I would want to help my family once I understood their financial situation. I know I made mistakes, she testified, tears streaming down her face. But I never meant to hurt my mother. I was just trying to find a way to save my family. Patricia's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. Mrs. Moore, you testified that you were trying to save your family. Where was that concern for family when your mother was undergoing cancer treatment? I was dealing with my own problems. I didn't know how to help. You didn't know how to visit? You didn't know how to make a phone call? You didn't know how to sit with your mother during chemotherapy? Sarah's composure cracked completely. I was scared, okay? I was scared of seeing her sick, scared of dealing with the possibility that she might die. It was easier to just stay away. Easier for whom? For me, Sarah whispered, finally admitting the truth that had been obvious from the beginning. And when you learned that your mother had inherited millions of dollars, did you think it might be easier to reconnect then? Sarah couldn't answer. She just sat in the witness box, crying, as the full scope of her selfishness was exposed for everyone to see. The closing arguments were masterful pieces of legal theater. Patricia systematically destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt for Sarah, emphasizing that desperation didn't justify elder abuse or fraud. The defendant wants you to believe that financial pressure excuses abandoning a cancer patient and then trying to steal her inheritance, Patricia concluded. But there is no excuse for this kind of betrayal. Sarah Moore made choices. The choice to abandon her dying mother, the choice to lie to her own daughter, the choice to commit multiple felonies against an elderly woman who had done nothing but love her. Those choices have consequences, and those consequences are what we're here to determine today. Preston made a valiant attempt to generate sympathy for his client, arguing that Sarah had already lost everything that mattered to her and that prison would serve no purpose except revenge. Sarah Moore has lost her family, her reputation, her freedom, and her relationship with her daughter, he argued. She's not a danger to society. She's a broken woman who made terrible decisions when faced with impossible circumstances. Mercy is not weakness. Sometimes mercy is justice. After deliberating for just 3 hours, the jury returned with their verdict. On the charge of breaking and entering, how do you find the defendant?
Guilty.
On the charge of forgery in the first degree, how do you find the defendant?
Guilty.
On the charge of attempted fraud, how do you find the defendant?
Guilty.
On the charge of elder abuse, how do you find the defendant?
Guilty.
Sarah collapsed as the verdicts were read, sobbing into her hands as the reality of lengthy imprisonment finally hit her. Emma fled the courtroom rather than watch her mother's complete breakdown. As the bailiffs prepared to lead Sarah away, she turned to look at me one final time. "I'm sorry, Mom," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything." I met her eyes with the same cold indifference I had shown throughout the trial. Sorry doesn't give me back 3 years of fighting cancer alone. Sorry doesn't erase the lies you told Emma. Sorry doesn't undo your attempt to steal from me. Sorry is just another word, Sarah, and words don't mean anything coming from you. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Sarah was led away to await sentencing. Judge Keating scheduled the sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, but everyone knew what it would be. Multiple felony convictions for elder abuse and fraud carried mandatory minimum sentences that would keep Sarah in prison for years. Justice, I reflected as I walked out of the courthouse into the cold winter air, was sometimes as satisfying as it was inevitable. Judge Keating's sentencing hearing took place exactly 2 weeks after the guilty verdicts, in the same courthouse where Sarah had been convicted, but with a noticeably smaller crowd. The novelty of the trial had worn off, and most of the media attention had moved on to fresher scandals. I arrived early, as had become my custom, wearing a charcoal gray suit with my pearls, the same jewelry I'd worn to every court appearance, a visual reminder of the dignity and class that Sarah had tried to destroy through her betrayal. Emma was not present. My granddaughter had called the night before to explain that she couldn't bear to watch her mother receive a prison sentence, even though she understood that justice required it. "I love you, Grandma," she had said through tears. "And I'm grateful that you're finally getting justice. But I can't watch them take her away." I understood. Emma was 19 years old, still trying to process the complete collapse of everything she believed about her family. Watching her mother sentenced to years in prison would be traumatic regardless of how richly deserved that sentence might be. Sarah entered the courtroom looking even more diminished than she had during the trial. 2 weeks in jail awaiting sentencing had stripped away the last vestiges of her former confidence. She moved slowly, her shoulders hunched, her eyes fixed on the floor. David Preston had filed several motions requesting leniency, arguing that Sarah was a first-time offender who had acted out of desperation rather than malice. All had been denied. Judge Keating was known for his strict interpretation of elder abuse statutes, and Sarah's crimes fell squarely within the categories that carried mandatory minimum sentences. Before I impose sentence, Judge Keating began, I want to address the nature of these crimes and their impact on the victim and the community. He looked directly at Sarah, who was finally forced to meet his gaze. Mrs. Moore, you have been convicted of multiple felonies committed against your own mother, an elderly cancer survivor who should have been able to trust you above all others. The evidence presented at trial shows a pattern of calculated betrayal that began with abandoning your mother during her illness and culminated in attempting to steal her inheritance through fraud and forgery. Sarah started to speak, but Judge Keating held up his hand. The court has reviewed the victim impact statement submitted by Mrs. Whitfield, and I have rarely encountered a more comprehensive account of family betrayal and its consequences. You didn't just commit crimes against your mother. You destroyed the fundamental trust that binds families together. He consulted his notes, then delivered the sentences that would define the rest of Sarah's life. On the charge of breaking and entering in the first degree, 5 years in state prison. Sarah's attorney had warned her this was coming, but hearing the words spoken aloud caused her to sway in her chair. On the charge of forgery in the first degree, 7 years in state prison, to run consecutively. On the charge of attempted fraud, 5 years in state prison, to run concurrently. On the charge of elder abuse in the first degree, 10 years in state prison, to run consecutively. The mathematics were devastating. Even with the concurrent sentence, Sarah was looking at 22 years in prison. At 38 years old, she would be 60 before she was eligible for parole. Additionally, Judge Keating continued, this court orders full restitution to Mrs. Linda Whitfield in the amount of $200,000, representing legal fees, security costs, and emotional damages. The restitution was largely symbolic. Sarah would never have the means to pay such an amount from prison, but it served as a formal recognition of the harm she had caused. Judge Keating concluded with a statement that would be quoted in legal journals studying elder abuse cases. This sentence reflects not only the severity of these crimes, but society's commitment to protecting elderly citizens from exploitation by family members. The defendant's actions represent a fundamental violation of the trust and care that children owe to their parents. Her punishment must serve as a deterrent to others who might consider similar crimes. As the bailiffs prepared to lead Sarah away for the final time, she turned to face me. 22 years, she said, her voice hollow with disbelief. You're taking 22 years of my life. I looked at this woman who had abandoned me during cancer treatment, lied to her own daughter about my wishes, forged my signature, and attempted to steal my inheritance, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. You took 3 years from me when I was dying, I replied quietly. You took my trust, my peace of mind, and my belief that family meant something. 22 years seems like a bargain in comparison. I'll miss Emma's entire adult life. I'll miss grandchildren I'll never meet. I'll miss everything that matters. Yes, you will. Just like I missed having my daughter's support when I needed it most. Sarah's face crumpled as the full impact of her sentence hit her. She would enter prison as a young woman and emerge as a senior citizen, having lost everything that had mattered to her. This is too much, she whispered. The punishment doesn't fit the crime. I stood up and walked closer to where she sat in handcuffs, wanting her to hear every word clearly. The punishment fits your choices, Sarah. You chose to abandon your dying mother. You chose to lie to your daughter. You chose to forge my signature and attempt to steal from me. Every year of that sentence represents a choice you made. I was desperate. You were selfish. There's a difference. As the bailiffs led her away, Sarah looked back one more time. When I get out, you'll be gone. I'll never see you again. Good, I replied. That was always the point. Our book, Reclaiming Your Peace After Pain, contains powerful strategies for women who refuse to be victims. Like Linda, you have the strength to turn your pain into power, your betrayal into triumph. Don't let anyone convince you that your best days are behind you. They're not. Click the link in the description and discover how to reclaim your life today. The courtroom emptied slowly, with court personnel and observers filing out into the hallway where reporters waited for statements. I declined all interviews, having said everything I needed to say in court. Outside the courthouse, Detective Calloway approached me as I waited for my car. How does it feel? He asked. Justice served after all this time? It feels exactly like what it is, I replied. The natural consequence of choices freely made. Any regrets about pushing for the maximum sentence? I thought about that question seriously. Did I regret seeing my daughter sentenced to decades in prison? Did I feel any maternal instinct to show mercy, to ask for leniency, to try to preserve what remained of our relationship? Detective, I said finally, some betrayals are so complete that mercy becomes complicity. Sarah didn't just commit crimes against me, she destroyed the very concept of family loyalty. Her sentence ensures that other elderly parents won't suffer what I suffered. Detective Calloway nodded approvingly. The Elder Abuse Unit sees cases like this more often than people realize. Your willingness to prosecute fully will make others think twice before trying similar schemes. As I rode back to my penthouse, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 3 years ago, I had been a cancer patient abandoned by her own daughter, fighting for my life, while the person who should have been supporting me acted as if I had already died. Today, that daughter was beginning a 22-year prison sentence while I lived in luxury, surrounded by friends who respected me and supported by a granddaughter who had learned the difference between family and DNA. Some might call it revenge. I called it justice. The difference I had learned was in the method rather than the outcome.